well.
Look who we have today, everyone. I'm going to point to people. Let me get my, up a little bit, my point of view. Now I'm going to turn the titles on. Here they are. Over this way. I don't know which way it is on camera. It's Alex Gallner from the UK, all the way from the UK.
Hello, everyone.
Down to the screen's left lower is Brad Olson from Off the Tracks. And
Hello.
directly below me is Mr. Bill Davis from California. Not Bill Davis from Apple. That's a different Bill Davis, right?
Definitely. We are not the same person.
And you guys have never been seen in the same room at the same time. I keep saying that.
That's untrue. We have actually been in the same, and I have a photo somewhere of the two of us in the same
Photoshop.
place at the same time.
Photoshop. Absolutely Photoshop. So we have something coming up in, 4 days, WWDC?
Well, Apple has something coming up that I guess we'll watch.
And Tim Cook is, it's funny that I emailed somebody and I said, is Tim going to do his presentation from the Spaceship Campus? And they said, they don't know. I said, he is. I found out that, yes, he is. He absolutely is. That's where the big theater is, right? That's where the Steve Jobs Theater is?
Yeah, It should be interesting with nobody there, but probably a few Apple support people. So he'll be in a big room.
There might be some Apple people there, 6 foot apart.
Yeah.
Don't you think?
Yeah, I would still have a retinue of people who are working on the thing and maybe some select people from the campus who have come to it. But that's a big hall.
Yeah, and it's also very difficult to do a presentation with no audience. There's a huge difference between having a live audience and feeling that energy and having nobody in there. It's just like a vacuum, like an energy vacuum.
Yeah, somebody was saying in one of the sports things that they tried to do a game. This was one of the big arena type things with no crowd. And then they found they had to pump in audio noises because it was really hard for people to work with no feedback whatsoever.
Right. Alex, what's going on in the UK?
I don't know. I've been busy working all day, so I haven't been paying attention.
It's not snowing there, right?
Well, we have had some quite wacky weather in terms of some big, hailstones about this big for about 5 minutes in the middle of the afternoon. So it's a kind of a muggy day. The jet stream's changing over the last few days, so it's going to change again soon. So, Yep, weather, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. Brad, what's going on in Utah?
There was like 25-mile-an-hour winds last night that woke up my daughter, and then a bunch of rain, and so kind of wacky weather in its own way. We had hot heat over the weekend with fires, and then winds, and then a big rainstorm. So there was a few small fires, human-caused fires over the weekend.
Human-caused fires?
Yeah, people shooting off explosives and stuff. I don't know.
Fireworks. Yeah.
No, somebody like shooting like actual weapons. So out in the fields. I kind of live a little further away from Salt Lake now these days, and about 40 miles south of Salt Lake, and I'm on the edge of the frontier, I guess you could say.
Okay.
So anyway, there was a small fire, 1 acre fire on the other side of the hill, I guess, for me. So yeah, it's been exciting. People are bored, I guess.
Yeah. Well, they have complaints. We have local Facebook groups, and they've been complaining about fireworks, for no reason that they can think of. I mean, Flag Day was a couple of weeks ago, but
Flag Day was last weekend.
Was it?
Yeah.
Okay. Somebody surmised it might have been that, but I don't think so.
I don't know.
They just set off fireworks. They buy them and they set them off, and they're actually illegal in Maryland. There's only certain kind of fireworks you can have, the dull kind, there's the real safety kind, but they find them in Pennsylvania, neighboring Pennsylvania. We're on the Mason-Dixon line, so Pennsylvania's to the north and Maryland's to the south, and I'm the county that's right below that Mason-Dixon line.
We used to have growing up, it was similar with Utah and Utah and Wyoming. Wyoming had all the illegal fireworks for Utah, and people would cross the border to go get them. But
right.
Then they decided they'd just let people burn down their homes for some reason, and let us shoot off whatever fireworks. But out here, it's pretty crazy. It'll be interesting when 4th of July comes. It feels like a battlefield. The homes are lighting up and
right.
Frontier.
So before WWDC is Final Cut Pro's birthday, the day before. June the 21st. Go ahead, Alex.
9 years old. Yes. So it's 364 days today because we've got an extra day for the leap year, I suppose, something like that.
That's
363 days. Yeah. So happy birthday, happy 9th birthday. Only 1 year of they're going to run out of their plan in just over a year, their 10-year plan.
Well, when they said 10-year plan, people are taking that literally, but I think they were just saying at least 10 years, not that they were going to end Final Cut Pro in 10 years, right?
Oh, no. I mean, their plan that they had in theory back in 2011 was the fact that they had 10 years of plans at that point. And hopefully they've thought of some new things since then, but we'll see. Yeah,
well, we will see. So I wonder how many of the original people, Brad will know this, were around 9 years ago and they're still there with Final Cut Pro team?
Luke Tristram was there.
Okay, so that's one. That's one.
Colleen, the lead designer, was there because her name's on all the patents that Alex pulls up.
But she's not there anymore, right?
Colleen?
Yeah, thought she left.
I think so.
No, I think you're thinking of Estelle.
Oh, Estelle. Okay.
Estelle's not with us.
Okay, so that's two.
Okay, and then Pete Steinauer was on stage presenting Final Cut Pro at NAB, and he's the lead architect.
So there's three. So I guess
don't know. I'm sure there's a bunch of people that have shifted around, and I know, we know that Wes Plate and Tim Dashwood are friends of ours that have been hired by Apple. So
I guess my question is actually, I wonder if their vision then has been realized now, or if it has completely changed along the way, along the last 9 years.
Well, I had the opportunity to have lunch with Randy Billos once upon a time. I know Alex interviewed him back when he retired, so we both kind of had. And then, of course, for the documentary, I interviewed him. But I remember him talking about some ideas for Final Cut that he hoped they'd get back around to at some point. Nothing secret, by the way. But it seems like for a while there was, 2018 especially, there was this like energy to get push to get a lot of less sexy features, I guess, and more kind of professional, functional features.
Nuts and bolts, maybe?
Well, like we got closed captioning, we got workflow extensions, we got a bunch of those kind of pro workhorse type of features in 2018, none of them meriting a full update. So I think as far as, a magnetic timeline 3.0, we got a 2.0 with the audio rolls. Will we get a 3.0 with like changing how clip connections are managed, or some timeline improvements like that? I don't know when that stuff might be coming. I still feel like there's a few things on the pro level checklist, the smallest one being collaboration. I say that.
Yeah,
but you've got to go into infrastructure for that, and those huge changes, right? The library model change at 3.0, the roles and the rest of the plumbing overlay later on, those were fundamental. And I think we're at the point where there's tension, because I know I keep saying, gosh, this works really well right now for me. The way I use it, I don't even think about 10 anymore. It running under Catalina for me is a come in on a deadline, get the work done, and send it out. And nothing gets in the way of that for me, which is vastly valuable. So if they're going to go in and do something foundational and build up a new infrastructure underneath it, I don't want to, I'm hoping that they do like most of their updates, which have been amazing. I don't think an update for me, and I'm so solid with them that I keep them on all the time. I mean, I keep on auto update, and I've never done that with another piece of software, because what they push is generally solid.
It's I wonder when we're going to fully embrace that, because I still see a new version come out and Richard's right there with, here are the instructions for safely updating, and everybody's like, is it safe to update? And I'm kind of like you, Bill. I'm like, whatever.
Well, here's a perfect example.
The smallest thing I do is I may zip the application
Right.
before.
Right.
That's about it.
But
there's nothing wrong with being safe. And if you're on mission critical deadlines and you've got clients that are depending on this work getting out in 2 weeks, then you're nuts if you just tear it apart and redo it.
Well, the thing about it is, if you remember Final Cut Pro, at least 2 times, if not 3 times, Alex will probably know, they had an update within 30 days because the major update introduced bugs. And they just did the exact same thing with Logic. Logic 10.5 came out. I went on Twitter and said, are we going to get an update to fix these bugs in Logic 10.5? And people said, we just got it. What are you talking about? And then a week later, it was there, 10.5.1, within 30 days of releasing.
Which says to me that those bugs, real as they are and annoying for a subset of users, might be about things that the large majority of the users don't touch or don't use. So you've got a bug that affects everyone, and they're going to jump on that super fast. You've got a bug that's talked about a lot on the internet that gets some spikes, right? Like the waveform monitor, and when they do the color rebuild, is a lot of chatter about it's not perfect, so they have to go in and fix that. But then the little things, you're always going to annoy some subset of people.
Well, I don't know if their intention was annoying. What are you going to say, Alex?
Well, I suppose if we're talking about WWDC and how that impacts Final Cut Pro and the plans, we don't know, obviously. None of us anyone who knows the truth behind this can't say, and they can't tell us about it. But it's interesting to think about what Apple's plans were back in 2000 and late 2009, 2010, when they started to kind of throw everything out and create Final Cut Pro in the first place. They obviously had to make a choice as far as we know, for what Philip Hodgett says, they had to make a choice very quickly about how to store everything and what kind of database to use. And the question is, how did that choice impact what they were going to do in the future? Because in practice, in 2009, it wasn't like they thought, well, this database doesn't have to work with multi-user workflows because this app is never going to be used for a multi-user or for collaboration. They must have had part of that plan saying, well, let's plan this app. We don't actually have to have a collaboration on day one, but we have to allow for it in future. And that's what we really liked about Final Cut Pro 10.00 was the fact that the menus are quite simple, and it initially didn't seem very powerful. But then when you realized everything that could be done, you realize, lots of space for future improvement, but lots of stuff not getting in the way of people learning things. So one day we'll find out what that database choice was and why it was made that way, and why they haven't been able to change that foundation. If that is the problem, as far as we can tell, the problem for doing collaboration is the fact that they had to, or were told to choose a certain database, or who knows. The reason why I'm mentioning this now is the fact that WWDC is about Apple telling Apple what they're doing, because it's quite likely that people, other parts of the operating system, both Mac OS and iOS, they've got lots of plans, and the Final Cut team are not going to know about them until Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of next week, along with us, because that's the way that Apple works. So maybe this is a series of decisions made by the rest of Apple that have caused problems for the Final Cut team, which means that it wasn't like they said in 2011 or 2010, we'll do collaboration in maybe 2021. It doesn't.
Right.
Why would you say, let's wait 10 years?
Right.
So the question is, what was the plan and what has delayed things in practice? And it's not like these people aren't working hard, 70-hour weeks, 100-hour weeks. It's the matter of what it is that is other things that have been doing that have been deemed more important either by them or by other people inside Apple. But WWDC is about what's going to be in the operating system that's coming out towards the end of this year. And what we do with Final Cut is they kindly make it so Final Cut doesn't need the most latest operating system.
Right.
So really, this is telling us what will be supported in the operating system that's out, that Final Cut may require in the fall of next year. because they give us a year's grace. I haven't updated to Catalina, which means that and the current version of Final Cut hasn't required it. So this WWDC, all being well, and what the operating system can do, will be a hint of what Final Cut will be supported in doing towards the end of next year. Whether the team are allowed to or can use those OS resources to do those things, we'll find out.
And of course, the market is always changing at the same time, too. I mean, we just went through this huge, everybody was working in offices, to a big migration to everybody working at home. And so a database that resides on your machine is one thing. A database that lives in the cloud is another thing.
Sure.
There are 1,000 aspects of how fast does that access work and how well, as we've all seen, right? A Zoom meeting can be great and then horrible and then great.
Right,
and horrible.
right.
And so that's hard.
Well, I wanted to unpack. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Brad.
I was going to say I want to unpack a couple things that Alex talked about, which, going back to the initial database for Final Cut Pro 10, I actually thought when projects and events were separate libraries, as annoying as that was, it pointed to a little bit more of an open kind of collaborative future. It just seemed like with events and projects being separate, it would be easier to lock them individually and share them. They were visible at the Finder level, right?
Right.
And if you remember, when it first came out, you couldn't actually put those libraries on shared storage. That was an update that allowed you to do shared storage. And then when they came out with the library model, all of a sudden all our media and projects were closed inside this bundle. And of course you could store your media externally, but it changed the nature. It was much more convenient for the individual user, but if you were moving to a more collaborative future, now you start having to ask questions about how do I access somebody else's library? Only one person can have it open at a time. And of course, it was the similar in 10 with the separate projects and events, but they were so much more accessible. And then moving on to the current state of the cloud, you can't obviously put a Final Cut library on, like, for example, my desktop is shared on iCloud, and I cannot put a library on my desktop because it's that structure, library structure, whatever the database is not supported by the type of shared storage.
Right.
I don't know which one. It's not SMB and it's not one of those, but it's a something. Anyway,
I don't know. It's all confusing.
So somebody has to figure out, so what's the killer thing? Do you want accessibility, which is a great thing, right? Everything lives in the cloud and I just hooked up to it's fine. Then suddenly security raises up an ugly head. Well, if I can a hacker get to my databases and mess up my edit? So suddenly you're trying to figure out things that are way beyond just what's good for me as the user.
Yeah. Back in those days of the library and separate library and event
libraries. Yeah.
Well, first off, I didn't use the libraries.
Project?
I didn't use projects. I just used compound clips in those days, and I got so much grief because it was all being in one folder that way. Everything was in one folder, and people kept saying, "What are you going to do when they change something and you can be able to update your libraries?" I said, "It'll be fine. It'll be completely fine," and of course it was. But my point was that those were Bill's best days because he had the project library. He loved the project library. I do too. I liked it as well. Right?
Yeah. It just made sense to me to have that horizontal stripes of all my projects. And I thought, I can manage these. I can deal with them. I can name them differently and sort and shuffle them. And so it actually reminded me of FileMaker Pro a lot. And I've always thought that's interesting that Apple owns a database, a semi-relational database that is gigantically used out there, is very collaborative, right? Because people make huge interactive databases for a public-facing set of apps within the database they run. And you just wonder, so they must have people who know databases really well. And then they've got this SQLite thing in the middle of 10, and you're figuring out, well, are they not talking? Do they not want to talk? Are there issues with talking? And I always think this is imagination. Is there a team off there somewhere working on what do we build to virtualize if this all has to go software as a service at some point and lives in the cloud so that you can really distribute the workload? I don't know anybody, who knows?
But I mean, I think, I don't know if we'll ever find out, but who knows? Maybe they said, well, we'll use MySQL until we get the promised database that the rest of the macOS people have been promising us, and that'll be available by 2012. And we're designing everything we do inside Final Cut so that it'll be able to work with the macOS that comes out in late 2012. But we want to bring this out now. So we'll just do this temporarily. And then the macOS people say, oh, no, it's going to be another year. And then the macOS people say, well, your schedule is not important to macOS and doing these kind of data services and doing a proper database. And I mean, we've all seen how effectively terrible for many years cloud services were, and for other app developers for macOS. So I just get the feeling, or the Final Cut team, effectively their outputs seem to be the outputs of people who are being messed around a lot for at least 10 years. And that's what it kind of looks like to me. Not that the software isn't fantastic.
Right.
Not the software is very smooth and rock solid and fantastically engineered. But the priorities don't seem to be of the, I'm lucky enough to have met Colleen, and she, of course, never tells me anything about the downsides or the problems that they've been having with anybody. But it's more that once you meet the smart people who actually work for that team, you think, would that smart person produce this kind of output over 10 years? And the answer is no. So there must be reasons why that hasn't happened. And we may never find out what that is. But it's a matter of bearing in mind the difference between the Final Cut Pro team, Mac OS, and then the needs, as I've said before, of to be able to market Mac OS, which means Final Cut Pro is the easiest thing to market Mac OS for pros, and to market Apple hardware and whatever Apple's into next. And to help journalists understand what Apple's into next, they use Final Cut Pro as their kind of I don't know, dancing monkey or something like that. So it's, who knows, I mean, and to the extent that maybe we have to teach the wider Apple how they're actually missing out on by messing around with the Final Cut Pro team. They're actually missing out on proper video literacy and empowering millions of people all over the world, because they see it. They don't actually understand how important Final Cut Pro could actually be.
What's interesting to me is that I just look at one little aspect, right? First, we know that they've always talked about progressive disclosure, that's one of the foundations that 10 is built upon. You can have it in a simple mode where a simple editor can use it and it's not terribly complex. And then you turn on more complexity as you learn the software and go into it. And I'm just thinking about the interface. Remember, we had a menu bar in the center that used to have things like the reject, favorite, tags that were right up front, so that as you were coming to 10 in the first 6-7 years, that stuff was kind of in your face, almost as if saying, hey, this is important, learn how to use these tags, metadata tags, because it'll make your editing better. But then I guess it was somewhere around year 6 or 7 they did the
2016, 5 years in, which was
5 years. So they completely eliminated those tags on the dashboard. And suddenly it was like they're saying, well, we expect you to understand this now. And if you're going to come into it now, you have to have somebody to train you into how important those aspects of managing the database are. That's interesting. I mean, that's a big change for them.
The ratings are, you have to know the keys now. I would say the tools, though, there was an effort to put the tools next to areas that made sense so that there was less dragging the mouse across the screen, I think was the idea. And it's like, this is more immediately accessible where I need it. So if I'm in the timeline, I have all the timeline tools. If I'm in the viewer, I have, the transform and everything's up here. And if I'm in my browser, the relevant tools are there. So that was the thinking behind moving those things around. But I was surprised to see the ratings. We still have the keyword button, but I was surprised to see the ratings go away. At the same time, I'm really happy that we have, I click on it all the time. I don't actually use the shortcuts. I click on the little buttons to turn off the timeline in the browser all the time. So that was a useful change. But, sometimes you have to just make those decisions moving forward. And I don't know if they polled people, if they saw how much, new users were using ratings. I've talked to new users who are completely surprised that they can use keywords and ratings. So
right.
even pre 10.5 or 10.3. Sorry.
And that's a sad artifact of the fact that a lot of learners, and I still do the same way. You get a new piece of software, you launch it, and you say, I'm just going to start clicking around to see how this works. Mm-hmm. And you're expecting that as you try and fail, try and succeed, that's how you come to mastery of the software over the first year you use it. But I'm surprised because with 10, there are these things that are hidden away back there that I don't think it's very intuitive. For example, the subtleties of the magnetic timeline and how I don't think that's intuitive for somebody coming after a history in regular timelines. They just don't understand they can do that. And so you get into that circumstance where somebody tells them about position mode, and they just go in position mode and they try to make it work as much like their old NLE as possible, and therefore retard their understanding of how this tool actually works by months, if not years.
So I've been reading this book called The Design of Everyday Things, which is written by a former Apple employee. And it made me think a lot about, editing software is complicated. It's not going to be as easy to design as a light switch. But you were talking about some things, the timeline that made me think about this, and 3 things that I wrote down in Final Cut Pro 10 that I think don't have obvious signifiers or ways to, like, this is how you do that. But one is the gap clips. I've noticed a lot of new users coming in, they'll like find a solid generator or something, and they don't know how to make a gap clip. And there's not really an intuitive way to know how to do that. Of course, if you learn the position tool, you're like, oh, but Option W is not the most immediate thing. Another one is syncing audio in the timeline, which was something I saw come up a lot on the Final Cut users group. And I'm like, why are people doing this? Or why are they syncing audio and angles with compound clips? And I realized, because I just did the proper training, so to speak, and knew that in the browser you could right click and you could synchronize or make multicam clips or make a compound clip. And I thought, why would anybody skip past those 2 and choose the compound clip? Until I realized, for people coming from iMovie, there was no way to do that. So they were syncing their angles and their audio in the timeline, and they come over to Final Cut and they bring those bad habits with them. And I thought, well, why don't they just make it easier and allow somebody who's doing that to just lasso it in the timeline and create a synchronized or multicam clip just like you would in the browser, and then at least they wouldn't be making that mistake. And maybe once they saw it popped up in the browser, they think, oh, I can do that in the browser too. And then the third one, and you can interrupt on that, but the third one was indicators. I find that the indicators that are like a missing LUT or a missing effect that read out the whole screen is like really disconcerting. And it's like, why don't you just have a little icon in the corner and tell me what's missing as opposed to take over my whole screen? Anyway, Alex, you were going to say something on the timeline syncing.
I think this comes from a kind of the thought is metadata flows in one direction, and the timeline, the metadata can't flow from the timeline back, which is a more kind of point of principle that I think has maybe overtaken the UI a little bit, and it's made it so that it's actually Final Cut slightly harder to learn. Because imagine if auditions could be created in the timeline. If you just select 3 clips and say, okay, that's my audition. People would use auditions all the time.
Yep.
But people don't use auditions because they're created in a way that you don't think, I think I need to create these 3 alternate takes, and I'm going to go to the browser and I'm going to do it there. That's not how an editor thinks.
Well, you can drag a clip onto a clip in the timeline and then select audition, but you can't layer them on top and then select them and say auditions, which would be great. And the fact that you can create a compound clip in the timeline tells me that the metadata flow can be reversed in one instance. Anyway, go ahead, Alex. This is good.
But the thing is that I think you can keep the metadata flow, forcing it to go in that direction, if you want. But I think it would be a really good idea if you could have refresh metadata from timeline. You could select something in the browser and say, can I have some of that metadata, something that I've assigned in the timeline? And you could pick which timeline or which project you want to refresh it from. So you're doing something slightly odd, but it really helps you It
Right.
really helps you because you're just going refreshed from this timeline or that timeline
Sure.
or whatever you have to do. So it's about coming up with a user interface metaphor for that refreshing, for the metadata flow to be clear, and when you go against the flow to say you actually have to do something quite overt to go against it in order to, so because you know what you're doing, or you understand metadata and how it is shared across multiple timelines and different instances of added metadata that are on a specific timeline, and it goes back what actually the implications for you. So you kind of have to create little bumps in the road, but it's still a good idea to be able to do it if you actually, if that helps you learn the whole concept of the value of the metadata. And that, I suppose, would mean having a metadata palette, because effectively if you had a palette, just one thing, one floating window, and say, look, we don't have floating windows in this app, apart from when we do, but we don't have many.
Right.
But to say metadata is so important that we will have a floating metadata palette, that it can be close to the thing where the metadata is being applied to, and it's constantly changing and moving, and it becomes the keyword metadata, and it becomes the raw clip metadata. It's it's just a thing to say this is the metadata editing application, and
Right.
surface metadata is a thing that matters all the time. It's worth bearing in mind. So it's always there in that respect. So you have your normal inspector, but you have a separate metadata palette separately.
Right.
To say,
I like that. Yes.
hey, this really
But
matters.
you're
to
adding
us,
a-
and it's worth getting to know. Yeah.
You're adding a monstrous layer of complexity, and I think so only because I remember sitting with Phil Hodgetts probably at NAB 7 or 8 years ago when he was writing his treatise on the different kinds of metadata and inherited metadata and user metadata and the rest of that. And it's almost like to do that would almost require some serious training, because the flow, and I agree with Alex, he kind of cautioned me into just thinking of it in terms of a flow, right? That camera metadata comes in with clips, and then you're going to be adding user metadata in the browser if you're doing tagging and things like that. And there's really a flow state all the way to the end when you export your clip and pop it up on YouTube. And if you don't understand the different types and you don't understand where they fit into things, you get yourself in a little trouble. And I have always used this example. You go in to rent a camera. You're finally moving up out of your little camera, and you go to your rental house and you rent a camera, and you come in and you shoot your project, and you eventually are happy with your edit. You decide to throw it up on YouTube. It's fabulous, and you get 250,000 votes, and somebody there downloads your highly popular clip, and they decide to throw it in a metadata reader, and they get to the point where it says who owned the camera, who's the director, and it's all the rental house, because you never dove in
Never
to
changed it.
understand that this pass-through of metadata is a real thing. And so if you don't rent the camera from the rental house and put your copyright information into it, you risk not having that in all the rest of the inherited metadata tags downstream. And so that's why I'm saying I think it has to be almost studied and understood at a beyond just it's a menu and I'm going to make choices.
Right. Well, I'm going to say one thing, two things real quick. Number one was what Alex was talking about, the everything flowing metadata from the browser to the timeline, except, as Brad said, compound clips. Because when you create a compound clip, it creates it back in the browser. So it does go backwards in that instance. Number two is, I know this is shocking, but I actually opened up Motion this week. I actually was in Motion. Yes, I was. I did it for a specific reason. I was doing the tutorial. I was so pleased with those floating HUDs that Motion has. I forgot how handy those things are. So if Motion can do it, I'm sure Final Cut Pro can do it.
I would just note on the compound clips, yes, that is the one thing where it reflects metadata upstream, but look what that means. It means you have to actually manage compound clips in terms of break the link if you don't want them updated in future projects. So there is more thinking. It's not just as simple as I'm going to make a compound clip and it's just going to be exactly like a nest. It actually has a little more, okay, I've got to do these things because I changed my first title and all the titles changed in my timeline. I don't want that. Well, now you got to go in and break apart, and they had to change the default on that. So it just it's the complexity.
Well, the other examples I can think of is, you can't make a multicam clip in the timeline, but if you open a multicam clip into the angle editor, that can ripple through if I add angles and everything that ripples back and forth. And then the other is LUTs, which I was really pleased when they did an update where you could select a synchronized clip and still have access to the embedded LUT metadata, but that changes universally across the app. If you change your LUT in the timeline, it affects it in the browser and in other projects. So that can be annoying sometimes.
Exactly my point about the compound clip. You have to understand it so you won't make mistakes. Alex?
Well, the thing is that I've met Colleen, and she seems to be one of the smartest people I know, especially when it comes to user interface metaphors, and as well as graphic design, the actual metaphor, and surfacing the model, so that their model of how they think about the app is actually goes into our subconscious without us realizing it. The answer is come up with a way to explain metadata overrides in multiple instances in one field having 17 different values depending on its context and where it is. Have a graphical way of doing it. Have a pop-up, a context, a color, a layer of transparency, a 3D effect. It doesn't matter. It's a thing that can be worked on from a few months or a year or however long it takes, and maybe was done 10 years ago, that actually explains how that values can be multiple things at once, and that can be very useful. And once you get into the context of essentially a different user interface element that shows that this is not a single value, this is a thing that can be overridden, and then it looks different now because it's locked, because it's based on source metadata, or it's overridden in various different places, or it's been disconnected and its previous value was on a certain date. This is essentially, do it with italic or bold or a slightly different color, a bit of transparency. Essentially, you just start reading the language of the different kinds of. You say, oh, how come these three different fields that seem to be the same kind of thing have different levels of typography or weight or color? Oh, okay, one is something I can change. The other was it's been changed by these three different people. I can pop up and see who changed it and when. I can accept which one, I can burn it in, and I can lose the other stuff. So you actually have the UI say this is different and maybe it's worth investigating why, and having a way of disclosing that difference in terms of history of value changes. And it's a thing that is worth sorting out. It's a thing that's worth explaining, because it's going to, if Apple want people awesome. To be, so what we're talking, so what happens is you actually teach people to say, that's one of the rules of user interface design. Show something as being different if it is different. And that's the problem with some metadata fields. They all actually look and say, well, can I click it? Can I edit it? That's the only difference, whether it's editable or not, which is...
Yeah, the only rule you cannot violate is you can't call a sequence a project or a project a sequence, because that'll make the entire internet go crazy.
That's one of the more minor points for me. I mean, I know Sean Lander wants that taken care of, and I understand that is confusing when you're going to people that don't know Final Cut and you use terms. I use project the way I want to use project. If I want to use it as a master container, that's what I use it as. Usually I don't use it to mean the timeline in Final Cut. Usually I say timeline. So.
Yeah, but the argument was always that project had a meaning and they changed the meaning and they were unhappy about that. But you could argue that a project in 10 is very subtly different, and that because of that they needed a new name. That's it's the religious war, and we don't want to go down that path.
Well, you are touching on something that I'm interested in, which is when I see long posts about here's what I liked in Final Cut 7 or here's what I liked in Avid, can't they just do this in Final Cut? And I'm not as interested in that conversation as more of what Alex is alluding to about thinking about the whole design philosophy of this application and expanding on that, as opposed to forcing something like tabbed bins, which was a weird one that I think Sean brought up, that I was like, why would I have and in Premiere I absolutely hate all the tabs because I don't know what's there in a window, and I have to like scroll over to the left or right to figure where my effect controls are, or where another bin is or another project, and it's just such a cluttery interface. And it's like, yeah, but you can move these panels wherever you want, and you can do it. It just looks like it stresses me out. It really does. And so, Final Cut, I'm focused and I pop this thing open when I want it and I close it when I don't. And if you have a way of improving, like there was an improvement in Resolve that I thought was very clever. I think it's on their cut page, But in Final Cut, how you have the directory, the library directory, and you can hide that. In Resolve, when you hide that library directory, you can still have a pop down and navigate to a folder. And I thought that was, something that could be implemented in Final Cut, where I don't need that screen real estate of that sidebar. I can hide it, but I can just briefly access it when I want it. And if I want to leave it open, I can leave it open. And that to me is a way to improve the existing design, as opposed to try to force in some old metaphors and ideas into an application that has moved light years beyond that.
And for the viewers, that's the timeline index.
Right.
I'm not talking about the timeline index. I'm talking about the in the browser. You have a sidebar where you can navigate through your events and libraries.
Okay.
And if you can hide it, and your clips take up more room, whatever your event you're in. But if you want to go navigate to an event, you have to pop that back open. In Resolve, there's a similar interface, and you click on it, and it's a drop down when you have it hidden. So you have the choice to hide it or not, but the drop down's there when it is hidden, which I thought was a clever way to navigate.
You don't just use
quickly.
the keyboard shortcuts for the Windows, because they all have them.
No, it's more, say, for example, you want to show all the clips with an associated keyword. In order to expand that out, you would actually have to have the list of keywords and click one of them or something like that if you weren't using the keyword palette, or maybe a smart collection or something like that. In this case, you just click the button itself which represents that. Instead of just tapping it, it would expand it out. You would maybe hold down, and then you'd have a hierarchical menu, and that would look like the list that you would normally be taking up space on your screen. Quickly choose it, and then it would just go away, and then the browser would show. This is what I understand.
So you're looking for an additional display mode, basically.
Yeah, I wish
it's
I
like
had my screen pulled up.
It's like having when you in classic Mac OS used to put your hard drive in the Apple menu, and you want to be able to go to anywhere on your Mac.
Right,
you just go to the Apple menu and just go.
Sure.
17 different layers, and then you go straight to that folder that you want that file from. It's kind of like that, but it only takes up the space of just the Apple menu in the corner of the screen, as opposed to having to list a whole hierarchical list of what's on your hard drive.
And I like the hierarchical list, and like I said, in Resolve it has it there, but when you hide it, you can still navigate, which I thought, like I said, it's a clever solution, so I don't have to pop it back open, resize my window, and then click on the thing and then close it. I actually do. When I'm especially when I'm in keyword and favorite film strip mode, I like to close that side navigator, whatever. I don't know what that's called, but I like to close it so that my film strips can take up more space, and I
right.
Is that a Finder thing, or is that a 10 thing?
No, it's in 10.
It's in the browser.
It's in the browser.
Picture the UI where your libraries and your events are, right? And the browser, that can be closed, and it can pop open. So we're talking about, instead of when you close it, still having access to it through dropdown.
Okay, all right. I just close it and open it, so I don't. Yeah.
Right.
Or set up.
It's just like, rather than open it and resize everything, leave it closed but still be able to navigate to it.
So
sorry, go on. Pardon me.
Go ahead, Alex. Sure. I was going to ask you a question, so go right ahead.
I mean, I was interested in talking about the WWDC next week and how to read it from our point of view. Because one of the things, firstly, to say is that the keynote, which is designed for everybody to watch, including people who aren't developers, people who don't even have any Apple products, it's designed to get attention from journalists and people from all over the world. What do we get out of when we see things like that from a Final Cut perspective? What are we likely to see? And the first thing to say is, what we would want is there to be somebody from the Final Cut team come up and talk about new features in Final Cut Pro, or some aspect of Mac OS associated that supports a new version of Final Cut Pro coming soon, all that kind of stuff. This does not happen for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's about developers, and what developers don't really want to see is one of the people that they're potentially competing with, and that has all the support of Apple, go up on stage and show how great their software is. Because essentially, seeing somebody from the Final Cut team showing how great a new feature will be because it's available in a future version of the Mac OS means, oh great, they've had access to that for 3 years, no wonder it's going to be good. Yeah, we have no chance.
Right.
But then you have somebody from the Adobe team saying, oh, the reason why Metal is so great in After Effects is I can do this, and the whole UI or Illustrator, and it'll scale up a multi-megabyte or a gigabyte size Illustrator file up and down in real time because we're using Metal. And all the developers go, wow, they obviously didn't, they haven't. That's good news. So that's one of the disappointments from a Final Cut perspective of WWDC presentations is the Final Cut team don't get to go up on stage because they are the competition of the people who are actually in the room normally, or the audience that it's ostensibly the WWDC is for. But Final Cut is the thing that journalists can understand. It is the thing that people know who think, well, I'm not going to buy one of those iMacs, but what do those people who use iMacs use for? Oh, video editing. That's probably quite a small proportion of the pro market, but it's a really easy to understand one because protein folding and biological experiments and all the kind of stuff that people actually do at modeling huge complex systems of things using Mac Pros. That doesn't look great on the screen necessarily. It produces a text result of 1.653 and the scientist goes, wow, that's amazing. Everyone goes, okay, I don't really get that. But if you show videos being edited that are really sexy and cool, then you say, well, a future version of the Mac OS will have, and then there's screenshot time for Final Cut Pro, because it's like our pro apps will be able to do this sometime in the future. And then the journalist goes, oh yeah, so that's what a Mac Pro is for, and they can kind of move on. So that's how to read the initial kind of presentation.
Well, and last year sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah, absolutely.
Last year at WWDC, I'm just like looking backwards. They, of course, were talking about the Mac Pro, and they also showed off. They had a Pro Apps guy for Logic up there showing off thousands of instruments. And then they did a quick little, let's pop over to Final Cut and play 3 streams of 8K, I think it was, or 3 or 4. And that was like it. And then afterwards they had a demo area with Resolve and Motion and Final Cut that I saw some famous YouTubers go over and check out. So it was interesting, but you're absolutely right. They have to tread carefully in not upsetting the third party people because this is the developers conference.
Sure.
And I'm sorry, everybody. I've got to sneak out. It's 10 o'clock now, and I've got to shoot today. And
thanks,
first
Bill.
Time we're doing California COVID rules shooting, and so I've got to go prep.
Yeah, thanks for stopping by. Anything you want to plug before you head out? Yours?
I'll see you guys all around the net the next time.
Don't forget your hazmat suit and your quarantine tent.
We had to go out late last night and get more hand sanitizer for the crew, so we're getting there. Bye.
All right. Thanks, Bill.
Bye.
See you.
The screen's going to rearrange. There we go. So the interesting thing for me is I never expected any kind of a Final Cut Pro presentation at WWDC. However, they could just drop in, oh, by the way, there's a new version of Final Cut Pro that just came out. That's all I'm really expecting. Remember when they had the MacBook Pro, Alex? You and I both bought one in 2016. I don't know if you kept yours or not. Oh, yeah. At the end of the presentation, she casually mentions, oh, by the way, that's the new version of Final Cut Pro. That was the day before the FCPX Creative Summit. That's all I'm really expecting if they do anything around WWDC. I'm not saying that they will, but if they did, just some kind of not a presentation, just an announcement or just a, hey, by the way, new version of Final Cut's out.
Well, I mean, the thing is that would make sense in terms of how is the message that there's a new version of Final Cut relevant to that audience at that moment? You could say, is that new version of Final Cut reflect something about the fact that the compatibility, that Catalina is a lot better, that the version of the software will also work in previous versions, that there has to be a kind of it's great news, and Final Cut's an example of some great news. And it kind of is that Final Cut's being used to illustrate a wider point to do with. So they may say, and look, for example, the advantage of using Metal is the current version of Final Cut is 3 times faster than the previous version.
Right.
Even though nobody has complained about the speed of Final Cut ever.
Exactly.
So you made a fast thing faster. Doesn't really matter. But from the point of view of developers, they go, oh, okay, I recognize that graph. That bar is a lot higher than the other bar, and it shows that it was worth their time investing in making Final Cut Pro into Metal. Use more of Metal. But yes.
I guess my point is, I don't think that the Mac Pro is done by any means. the Mac Pro. So if they introduce something else with the Mac Pro, they might say, by the way, they've already said on their website, this is the optimal machine to use with Final Cut Pro. So something along those lines. Here's a new feature of the Mac Pro, a new card we're introducing for the Mac Pro, and it does this with Final Cut Pro. That's all. That's a sidecar item, not as a main,
Oh,
main
sure.
item.
I mean, we could say, and now we're happy to announce that Afterburner, which is currently only used by very few apps in these ways, we're going to create an SDK that allows people to do new things with Afterburner. It'll make Final Cut be able to do this, and this, and third parties will have access to Afterburner to make it better. Absolutely.
There you go. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I mean, or they may define the new iMac or the new iMac Pro in terms of what more it can do because of Final Cut, and they demonstrate how much better Final Cut is in a new iMac Pro. That may look like the Pro Display XDR, or which is quite likely as well. There may be a new display that isn't a Pro Display XDR, but just a Pro Display. And suddenly $2,000 for a display will be seen very reasonable after a year of investing a lot more.
Right.
And they may use the same design language for the iMac Pro and as the Pro Display XDR. Lots of, stone grater. You know how they call cheese grater? I think we should call them stone graters now because they're so much rougher than a cheese grater. We can grate stone with this thing.
There you go.
You just coined that. Yeah, the stone grater. I agree with those things.
Yes, I would say no. I object. I don't want those things. No, exactly. Yeah.
Well, there's two. So there's a keynote. Tim Cook's doing the keynote at the normal time, 10 p.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. But then there's a second one that they promoted. Worldwide. It's the Developers State of the Union in the afternoon. Which is, I don't think they had that in the past. At least they haven't broadcasted it live.
Well, they have streamed it over the years. So essentially for the last 3 years or so, they have streamed all these sessions, and they've all been, nearly all of them, live. The only thing they haven't streamed live is the lunchtime sessions, which aren't about Apple. They're more like special guests, like Pixar people or special guests talking about great, cool stuff that developers might be interested in. They're usually during the lunch breaks and stuff like that.
Okay.
But no. Actually enough, the State of the Union, which is about the platform State of the Union, the OS State of the Union, that has been streamed for the last few years, and also available the day later to play it back later. You don't actually have to watch it live.
Right.
So that is usually about developer tools, specifically tools that will actually help develop for all the platforms that much better, and more detail about what was said during the main keynote, but it's essentially a version of the keynote which goes into more detail as soon as the developer goes, yeah, but you just said, about the data, about this format, about this number of 32, about the GPUs, or you've said something this morning, I'm a bit worried about it. In the afternoon is about saying, don't worry, we've thought about it from a developer perspective, and you're much more techie guys and gals, and you'll understand how we can now go into the details so we can reassure you and actually say it's even cooler than you thought, and we've thought it through the way you might not have thought it through, and we're going to explain ourselves a little bit more about what we said this morning. So that's kind of what it means by State of the Union. It's more about what this means for you as developers.
It's just never caught my attention before. For some reason, it's on like the main page, the second one. On they have an app now, a developer's app, they said, and they're also streaming it live on YouTube. I'm not sure if they've done that in the past. I've always watched it on Apple TV, which I will be doing this time as well. So, Brad, it's called the Sidecar. Nathan McAvoy said that the column in the browser.
It's called the Sidecar.
It's called the Sidebar. Sidebar. And then somebody else said this. I want to get your opinion. Sometimes XML just doesn't seem to be enough. Is there something better than XML? Is there something better than XML that could be?
I guess the question is enough for what?
Well, he said, I have to send the lighter backup library to someone. I'd like the process to be more simple, a la Final Cut Pro 7 or Premiere Pro to send files. I guess he's using it to update his library.
Well, I mean, I suppose in the case of XML, it's really how Apple define the new flavor of XML.
Oh, okay.
So essentially what you have with XML is you have a DTD, which is a way of just defining what each element in the XML can describe. So at the moment, Final Cut Pro XML could recreate a library almost, but there's some slight problems with specific overrides to do with text and formatting to do with text and titles and stuff like that. Because if you actually look at the definition of what can be expressed in XML, it doesn't actually include the slight variations people may want to include because they've made changes in title data and stuff like that. And also, if you open up the XML, sometimes there's just a load of mysterious numbers and letters and strange stuff that they stick in there, which is kind of where they kind of put their magic stuff to do with things like smooth cam or whatever it's called, that kind of stuff where they just go, it may be a secret source thing, it may be a thing where they don't actually want to define every single move that camera is making or where that data is associated, or because they think that the other copy of Final Cut, when it actually loads all that stuff, will be able to recreate all that data anyway, so it doesn't actually have to be included in the XML. So there's two elements that would be in an XML. There's the stuff that means any NLE of any kind who'll be able to read that in and then itself create a complete Final Cut library in its own terms. That XML doesn't exist. But in theory, the XML that exists now is enough so another copy of Final Cut will be able to recreate that library based on that XML, which is a slightly different thing because, of course, the other copy of Final Cut can do the weird things to do with, proxy workflow and media. And well, if you've been quite tricky yourself, Final Cut isn't going to know that you've kind of sneaked in your own proxy stuff and stuck it in the library and stuff like that. Of course, by definition, the XML isn't going to be able to express certain things. So yes, XML can express everything, but Apple have to kind of decide to do that, if you see what I mean. So that essentially, it would be fantastic if they helped the competition. It would be fantastic if they could say, we've now got this new app, LumaFusion, we'll be able to actually really completely recreate Final Cut libraries, and you'll be able to use it as competition. Because that's kind of what you want, really, in the long run, is you want the XML to fully express everything and it to be open. But maybe Apple might not want to do that.
Well, yeah. I would say compared to where Final Cut 7's XML was at, and I've actually had to send some Premiere projects over to Resolve with that XML, which is like a bastardized XML6, Final Cut 6 XML. It doesn't work that well. It doesn't use multicam clips. There's a lot that's lost. So we've come a long way. We know based off the Logic release notes that there's an XML 1.9 coming out.
Right.
So so we know that they're continuing to improve it. I'd say at the moment, if you're collaborating, if you're sharing projects with other people, that's what it sounds like if you're talking about a light library. At the moment, what we'd have to do is, if you're working on something with somebody else, is use this concept of a light transfer library where I'm going to move my event with my projects that I want to share with that person. I'm going to zip it up. They're going to open it up. It's not perfect, but that's what we have to do at the moment until we get what we were talking about before, which is this idea of true cloud collaboration, which that's a whole rat hole. But I did look up, it's AFP is the networking protocol or whatever for that you use for iCloud. So anyway, until we can put our databases on there and people can share, like right now with iWork, you have the ability to work on the same keynote and everything, and updates live. However, I found that some people get really annoyed with that. Like there's a tracking mode in Pages, and I was working with somebody last week who was really confused. Why is it highlighted? Why is it marked? What is this? What's going on? So I turned it off and we just were editing, but then it was like all our edits were permanent, and so there's a lot even in that environment that is a little uncomfortable and getting used to. And I don't think, I mean, we could take a quick poll between the three of us. Does anybody really want somebody else messing around with your timeline while you have it open?
Not at the same time.
I mean, what I might like to do is somebody for an audition, a series of clips inside an audition to be automatically generated, which became an alternate part of the timeline.
You mean if they were editing,
So what happens is you go, okay, I'm going to be working on this area of the timeline. You select them all and say, okay, I'm working on this. And then so Final Cut knows you're working on this. And then when somebody else you put that on somebody else's timeline, and then you get a message on your timeline saying, X has now created a audition of this part of the timeline that they're now working on, and they're now changing it. That means you'll be able to switch between your version of the timeline and their proposed version of the timeline, and you'll both be okay. You could be working on the same part, and then you'd be able to just review them, or somebody else will be able to review them and say what you want. So you've actually got the metaphor of auditions. If they're allowed to have more than one clip in them, by definition, you actually got a thing that's partially about collaboration. But I think that we don't necessarily have to go for all in a huge cloud-based database. That's the only way collaboration can work. I mean, it would be nice because then you'd be able to edit on your Apple Watch, because essentially it'll be connected to the same iCloud. You'll be able to change your clip collisions or something like that. Or something like that. Trim.
Alex,
I want the trim editor.
That up in motion for me. I want you to do a little video screen replace and show me how that would work.
I'd just be able to go from edit to edit like an Avid and just redo the, asymmetrical trims like I like that. Yeah. There. Exactly. But I think that people maybe are thinking a little bit too big, and also maybe a little bit too irrelevant to a large number of people. And I think maybe collaboration could be slightly different in terms of you've got your consultant working with a person who's not that experienced, but you're both working together. It doesn't actually have to be collaboration in terms of we've got 25 people all working on the timeline, the VFX people, or we need all these trims backwards and forwards, and all the turnovers are automatic between the audio people and the VFX people. And collaboration doesn't have to be like that. It can actually be in terms of knowing that somebody else is doing something, and your copy of Final Cut understands that there is another library, and they're somehow linked to each other. They don't actually all have to be connected to the same database, but wouldn't it be good if the UI itself admitted what a transfer library was, instead of it just going, you can create a really small library out of parts of it and it doesn't have any of the media. I don't know why. Because essentially that's what the user interface is doing. It's saying, I'm just doing this and I don't know why you're doing such a strange thing. And essentially what this is doing is supporting a transfer library workflow and collaboration system that can be sent to other people. They've already got the media. Why doesn't Final Cut Pro know? It's not like you actually both have to be, all the databases have to be tightly linked to each other.
Right.
Why doesn't Final Cut just go, by the way, that person has just created a new subclip and they've worked on that project for a certain amount of time. Here's some text that's being used in there, or some new metadata that's in their copy of the library. I'm not even talking about huge amounts. I'm talking about updates through whatever method. It doesn't have to be through iCloud. It could be for HTTPS or whatever it has to, iMessage.
Well,
in other words, low bandwidth communication about what other people are doing. That what we seem to be doing is fooling Final Cut through transfer libraries into doing something it doesn't even know about. And why doesn't the UI know that there are other editors out there? It's weird.
Yeah, and what it reminds me of is just going from track based to magnetic timeline, in that we have these clip connections that show vertical relationships, and it shows that the software understands that a title or piece of music or sound effect is related to the content. In a similar way with collaboration, to me, it's like the software identifying or giving you a signifier of like, yes, this is how I understand what you're trying to do, and I'm going to make this more obvious and transparent to help you do the thing you want to do.
I mean, if you're doing some VFX and the editor decides the shot that you're working on gives you it's 10 frames shorter or 20 frames longer, that's a useful piece of information. It's not like you're the VFX person has to have a copy of the Final Cut library with all the media on it. You want a system so they just get the extra frames, or they're told, don't worry, you've got less frames to have to work with. So collaboration, that's, as we mentioned earlier, FileMaker Pro supported understanding what a Final Cut Pro timeline is. All the Final Cut Pro connects the multiple different kinds of timeline to each other. Then FileMaker Pro can be the cop. Oh no, maybe we shouldn't use that term. Egregious, evil. Can be the diplomat who's actually helping all these people work together in terms. So essentially you have collaboration. Collaborators don't need to see everyone's seeing the same library and everyone's seeing the same stuff, because different people are contributing different things. You don't want the director or the producer or the transcriber or the DIT to see everything. You just want to see the things they need to see to do what they need to do. Or the costume designer or the marketing person, or the marketing person can just see certain final edits or certain trailers or certain things with certain keywords or whatever. The hierarchy has to be organized by something else, and the something else can be FileMaker or any database system,
right?
Or opportunities for actual third parties to get really into buying into having that control. And as long as Final Cut actually knows that it's being used as an element in a collaborative enterprise of some sort, and that appears in the UI, that'll be a good thing.
Absolutely.
I seem to be merging with this weird thin library with just one timeline that's changed a little bit. I just don't know what that is. Why? Why doesn't it know what that is? That's what I want to know.
Yeah, well...
But this is not WWDC. I apologize. We're not talking about that.
I was thinking about... You're making me think a couple things. My initial proposal is kind of related to that, which was that there should just be a way for an individual user to control their library, but if there's an event or project or element in it, they can pick somebody using like an Apple ID. I'm going to share, this person will have some access, some type of access to this. And then the other thing I was thinking about is the evolution of Frame.io, in how there's ways to compartmentalize folders, make them private, or allow certain people in your team or collaborators see certain things, and having that kind of control over what they see that is relevant to them. Because you're right, like for a visual effects artist or a costume designer or somebody, it would be irrelevant for them to have access to everything. You don't want them to have access to everything. And one of the cool things Frame.io is doing now, I think for like an enterprise level, is on-the-fly watermarks, and that's something that would be really
I saw
cool
that
within Final Cut for a producer assistant or somebody you don't, like imagine if they could pull up the media, some sort of cloud server or something, but it automatically tag like who's got access, who is this that's looking at it, and those things could be important. Whether it's a company, a corporate environment where they don't want the latest whatever product they're working on to get out, or it's a movie, which obviously there's a lot of proprietary kind of secrets.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, filmmakers and TV show makers need to have one of their collaborators is an insurance company. So the completion bomb people need access to the timeline, almost in that respect, in terms of checking on the security and access and penetration tests in terms of security to make sure that it's still actually all okay. In terms, I'm sure Sony would like a penetration test regularly on their productions and stuff like that.
Right.
But in the case of WWDC, we kind of have to interpret what it is that they're talking about, what aspects, usually of macOS, and also how they talk about things, because essentially Final Cut Pro runs on macOS, but the things that support Final Cut Pro are available on macOS and iOS. So when they talk about the database part of macOS or the movie playing part of macOS, they don't actually say it's a part of macOS. They just say of what Apple make. So AV Foundation, which is used for making timelines and playing back video and getting information and metadata from clips, which is AV Foundation, a kind of subset to QuickTime, is a thing that's a presentation kind of worth watching in terms of what new features of movie editing that any app can do. In other words, putting clips together on its own internal timeline, not necessarily for users, and what will be available this autumn, this fall, to app developers, and what will be available to apps who maybe take a year, like Final Cut Pro, to require that. Because you can't have features at the moment. We've never had in the last 9 years. Final Cut has never said. It's rarely said. It's done it a couple of times. This feature is only available in Catalina. It's not available in previous versions of the OS.
Right.
It's happened a little bit, but very rarely.
Well, currently, we've got HDR tone mapping, which is available in Catalina and is not available in Mojave. Is that the previous one?
Yes,
I think so.
I always want to say the previous one's Yosemite. Even though that's a long time ago, I think Yosemite's got such a funny name that I kind of think that's the current one. So you go Sierra, fine, hi Sierra. Yosemite. It seems to go in that direction, but no, that's years ago. But Mojave and Yosemite are like stored in the same part of my stupid little head. So it's like, oh. But so AV Foundation is important in terms of a presentation to watch. To what extent, what parts of file of QuickTime have been re-implemented. So this is QuickTime, the part of the operating system, not QuickTime, the file format.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, the thing is that to some extent, if they are going to talk about moving over to the ARM processors, what is it about the way that codecs have gone away is really about re-implementing codecs actually again for ARM, for the ARM version of Mac OS? Because it's like, they're going to make a decision. Like, it's 2009. We're going, okay, eventually we're going to be 2010. We're saying that QuickTime is not going to be around anymore. And Final Cut Pro Classic was the demo app for QuickTime. Whatever QuickTime you do, one of the things, it's all based on QuickTime, the architecture. And Final Cut Pro is the demo app for AV Foundation in a funny sort of way. It demos a few other things, but from a point of view of its core thing of putting clip media together in sequence is an AV Foundation kind of thing. So did they say, okay, eventually we're going to have to re-implement all these codecs that like Radius DV codec from 1997 or whatever, random codecs from 23 years ago? Or shall we do a reset and say it's all going to come back? Then hey, it's good news. We're sorry here you have to move over to do lots of work to move over to ARM-based Mac OS. But the good news is we've now got tools for people to re-implement what codecs are. Because it's really weird at the moment. The kind of situation is like, who needs codecs? We don't need those things. The idea of making a format that any app can use and you just provide the information about your codec and then the app can use it. That's a silly way of doing things. Let's make it so every single video format has to be implemented by Apple and has to be delivered by it, or each individual app like Adobe actually has to implement their codecs themselves. That's a good system. Well, obviously not a good system, but this is kind of what they've been forcing themselves to do because of the 32-bit transition and the Catalina and that kind of stuff, and also for security reasons as well. So hopefully, maybe not this WWDC, but maybe next WWDC is like, okay, codecs are back and they're better than ever. Sorry about that, but we have no choice.
That's an interesting thing you bring up because I remember, last year we were having that whole codec panic, right? Of like what's going away, and there was the list. But what was weird is certain codecs that when I was first going over to Catalina said they weren't going to work. Like I think there's like a motion JPEG. There's a few that were supposed to go away, and I thought like I had stock footage files, for example, that I was converting last year, and now I'm downloading the same formats, or I found that old file, and they work. Some of them work. I don't know why. So I don't know if somebody did something to move that forward. Of course, there was the panic about Avid codecs, and Avid said, "Oh, we'll continue supporting it." And then Apple kind of made some deal with them. But that's still a weird transition because it's still not fully there. Right. So we're in a weird codec limbo at the moment. Some things work that said they weren't going to.
But that's what I mean is, it's like, hopefully this year or next year they'll say, "Sorry about that codec thing. Now you know why."
Yeah,
here's the new plan. As opposed to, even if it's saying, look, it's a fantastic third-party opportunity, as they say, we're not going to implement all these old codecs, but instead of all that old code working, and those because codecs are algorithms, and some are kind of IPs hidden, and those algorithms are black boxes, and Apple can't do anything about it, and sometimes they're just publicly available. Who knows? I can't remember the name. Obviously, Sorensen, for example. So you have the Sorensen codec. There is still some black box aspects to that. Even though it's kind of published, and lots of archives have video that was recorded in Sorensen back in 96, 97, 98 for motion graphics. Wasn't the right tool for it, but it was just a really good codec from that point of view because it was included in QuickTime, I don't know, 4 or something like that, 3. But now, who knows? Maybe Apple will just say, okay, here's the modern version of codecs, but that's just one kind of random little thing from WWDC. I mean, obviously there's things like in there, they're going to be explaining the future of machine learning, or automatically, or how machine learning can support apps like Final Cut in terms of recognizing content or tracking or learning.
So Alex, how is your poll on Twitter doing about motion? What's the results?
Let's have a look. Of course, I quit out of Twitter in order to be with you.
Well, he looks that up. I was going to bring up a nerdy thing. Sorensen Media, by the way, is in Utah, where I'm from. So
there you go.
Speaking of random codecs.
I think they kind of, yeah. I think the one that Sorensen bought by somebody recently for some random reason that it was like doesn't help, or I don't know. So we have.
It's been 10 years since I've really paid attention to Sorensen.
So we've got 30 minutes left on this poll that I put up on Twitter, and the poll was, the next update of Apple Motion will have new features that are needed to support new features in Final Cut Pro.
Oh yeah,
it's a pretty, or it's a bug fix update, and then it won't have any. But it's pretty likely that if it's a feature update, there'll be something that Final Cut Pro needs that Motion implements. Mm-hmm. But my poll asks, beyond features in Apple Motion for Final Cut Pro users, or to help Final Cut Pro do what it needs to do, how many additional features will there be? So I asked people to vote. I've got 75 votes so far, which is pretty good. And we've got another 35 minutes to vote on that. So if you go to Alex4D on Twitter, you'll see a recent tweet of mine. So currently the options were 0 to 3 new features for Motion users only, 4 to 7, or 8 plus. In other words, there'll be 8 features in the next version of Motion which are really to help Motion users make their lives better that don't directly support Final Cut Pro features. So the results are 0 to 3 new features, 48%, so that's half the audience, and then pretty evenly split, 25% and 27% between 4 to 7 new features, and a quarter of the people are pretty optimistic, thinking there's going to be 8 new features in Motion that are not for Final Cut Pro, and that's never happened in the last 9 years.
Right.
But hey, the thing about, is the next version of Motion going to be version 5.5? Is it going to be version 6? Is it going to be version 10 or a million? Who knows? But who knows what's going to happen with Motion? So yeah, 75 votes is pretty reasonable in terms of any of my audience, the Final Cut users mainly, but maybe some people are interested in Motion as well. So yeah.
So my question is this, because I had this question when I saw your poll. Does Motion develop things independently and then Final Cut Pro uses them, or does the Final Cut Pro team tell Motion, we want this, go ahead and make it for us? It's like a two-way street, you know what I mean? It could be going either way, or maybe it's a combination.
I think it's a combination because the Motion team, as we know, is in Culver City. So I think they have some, ability to kind of think independently. But I'm sure there's we need 3D text, and that has to come from Motion. So, and of course that benefits both applications. So of course we want to offer 3D text, hopefully in the future 3D objects as well. The interesting thing about Motion to me is I've played a bit around Motion. I wouldn't say I'm an Alex 4D or Mark Spencer or Robin Kurtz at Motion, but I've played extensively with it. I think I know what most of the buttons do. And this latest YouTube video I did, I actually built most of the animations I built in Keynote. And I actually really like the way, Keynote in a way it's similar. It's like behaviors that you order and you time for animations, and you can actually do a lot more than I thought you could. And I was thinking maybe there's a way to take some of this design metaphor, because one of the things that frustrates me about Motion is adding a behavior, not knowing quite what it's going to do, and accidentally putting a behavior or something at the wrong time. I'm like, no, I want this at the start, I want this at the end, or I want this.
Sure.
And you have to be real careful about those things. Yes.
Here's a good idea. Imagine if Motion could open Keynote files.
Whoa.
There you
Imagine
go.
that. Imagine this is how you teach people to use Motion.
Yeah.
Make it so that you animate what you want in Keynote, and you want a bit more control. You open it up in Motion, and it has a Motion project that implements everything that's in the Keynote file, and then all the behaviors are there in front of you, and you go,
yeah.
Oh.
The other thing I love about...
So if I move this a little bit to the left or right, change the timing of it, I know this behavior, I know this what this does. So that means implementing a whole load of new behaviors in Motion that can implement all the stuff that Keynote can do. And you go, well, that would be pretty useful. I'd like to have some of those Keynote things in Final Cut Pro.
Yep.
If Motion has to be able to implement them in behaviors to open up Keynote, then that's good news for me too.
Yeah. Well, and there's a ton of awesome shapes and content in Keynote that would be really helpful to have in Motion. And you can even, I even like the way, I mean, I've done custom shapes in both, but I found drawing shapes in Keynote, I don't know why, it's a little easier. So there's some things that I just think are a little simpler, and that would be awesome, because I could have taken this project, this exact one, and brought it into Motion and done a whole lot more with it.
So then you'll be creating a really weird Keynote presentation, because you know how you're going to break it apart in Motion before you put it into Final Cut, and only publish a few little bits so that the editor or the presenter just isn't able to change too much, but you've actually made a really special motion graphics for them from Keynote. I'll do it this way around, from Keynote to Motion to Final Cut. It'd be amazing. And so the idea of Keynote Motion being,
or publish your Motion stuff to iMovie. So now you can create a Keynote presentation that goes to iMovie.
Exactly. Or you can use Motion to create animations that can be used in Keynote. I imagine there's quite a lot of people who would benefit from using Keynote and using their own final animations created in Motion.
Yeah.
I mean, it's strange how, obviously, who knows how the Keynote team, and maybe the Keynote team, somebody demonstrated on stage in 2016 collaboration in Keynote at I think at the WWDC, to demonstrate that that's going to be possible using iCloud collaboration, and that was released in beta then, almost 4 years ago. But so I think Keynote could be, Keynote is iMotion,
right?
In a crazy sort of way,
sure.
And if Motion then becomes the tool for creating animations in multiple applications, like, so you open up Keynote, so you open up Motion and go, well, I've got a new project. I've got a thing called a Keynote transition or a Keynote text build. And that's a new thing that you can create in Motion. And then that could be built into the Keynote presentation. So you just transfer it to somebody else who doesn't have it. And then these files are small. They're a few hundred K. It won't make the presentation very large. Or it'll work on your iPhone or your iPad or something like that. And then Motion becomes that tool for creating animation tools for any app that wants to implement it. So yes, obviously there is a WWDC presentation from 2003 or something like that of an hour-long presentation of how to use Motion. It was the hour-long demo.
Is that right?
Behaviors and replicators and all that kind of stuff. And it was done at WWDC, showing replicators on the version 1 or maybe version 2 of Motion. Okay. And that was complicated enough and intriguing enough. And I think I was trying to show how great the GPU way of doing things was. So partially demonstrating that don't rely on CPUs to get faster and faster. Maybe GPU graphics and our wonderful OpenGL implementation. Sorry about that, folks. It was so good that maybe you should use it, because look how great Motion is. So it's crazy how the political needs or the practical needs of Apple are then supported by some random presentation on some motion graphics software back a long time ago. Yeah. Strange, right? So who knows? WWDC is the place for those sort of things, or middle hints of things like we're going to do stuff to do with machine learning, so it'll be able to help you with reframing shots based on people's faces, or choose all the because at the moment we have image matching of people, we can recognize it, but hey, the kind of machine learning we've been talking about for the last 3 or 4 years, we don't necessarily want automated editing, but maybe want something that's at least supported in some sort of way by the OS. Certainly find me pictures in my footage of people looking to the left, and I don't know, a little bit more of, or third parties saying, I've created a model that's going to recognize these things. It's going to help you create smart collections based on stuff. A smart collection based on a machine learning model that's been created by, say, for example, we have our friend who works at Caterpillar, Ben, and then imagine if he could have, Ben, imagine if he could get a machine learning model that recognized every single product that they make. And then Final Cut Pro will be able to do a lot more with all that footage, to go through their archive and create stories about a certain piece of machinery, because they've got the footage, but they actually can't recognize it yet. I don't know. I don't know. I just made this stuff as I go along, but it's the kind of thing that in the case of WWDC, the little parts of technology that they're talking about to do with AR or 3D rendering or game engines or stuff. I find it very interesting from the point of view of what might be then possibly supported in Final Cut Pro at the end of next year. But that requires that they have control over their destiny, and they can do whatever they want for editors. Whereas at the moment, partially they seem to be doing stuff that is required for Apple for them to do, which is not the same as editors.
Right. So one of the things that I want to bring up again is that Tim Cook mentioned Final Cut Pro and Logic for the Apple earnings call. So the idea that they might mention them again at WWDC is not that far-fetched. The other thing is they might update the numbers at WWDC. That would be cool.
I mean, if they say a million people have tried use the trial and they've had 90 days of learning new stuff, and we've supported people through this through what's been going on recently. That would be amazing. I mean, the one thing about that financial stuff that I kind of think, does Tim actually know how little Final Cut Pro is used by professionals? Or does he? Because this is actually an official thing that he said.
Right. It's exactly. It's legal. It's legal.
He's legally saying that lots of professionals of all levels. Now, if you read the words, it is at all levels of what? And are they saying that 3 documentarians are now making stuff that they wouldn't have made before for people so they can watch them while they're in lockdown, and that's the benefit of Final Cut Pro? I just don't know if he really understands how little Apple is trusted by the people in film and TV, or does he know and not care, or does he know and doesn't know what to do about it? I'm very interested by what people outside our little bubble, how they perceive Apple's trust in terms of, you speak to any feature film editor or any workflow professional in London or LA or anywhere in the world, and it's 2011, and it's not right now. Right. We think they're stupid and deluded.
One of those conversations this year alone. It seems like every other week or every month I meet somebody that is in film and TV, and their mindset is totally 2011, and they're shocked when they hear about my documentary and who I've talked to. But I don't know. I got the sense that, in my head when I was listening to that earnings call, I was thinking about, when you talk about people entertaining us, I was thinking about the social media platforms and YouTube, and where the line of professional lies there, I'm not really sure, but that was the sense. That's what I pictured in my head. The other thing is, this isn't from anybody currently Apple or anything, but I did hear a piece of commentary from someone that I thought maybe that's an explanation, which was because I was asking, like, why doesn't Apple reveal these numbers? It's been years since we got that 2.5 million users or seats.
Seats, exactly.
And this little insight I thought was interesting, which was perhaps Phil Schiller thinks it's too defensive. And, it's like we have something to prove with our software and we have to show. And then I've also, Philip Hodgetts used to make the argument that there are more people using Final Cut than Premiere and Avid. But now I don't know, because the last fall, when Adobe was compromised, I think half their users' information or emails were compromised.
Well, that was last week. That happened again. There was some kind of a shutdown.
Yeah, that happens regularly. But there's an estimated 15 million people subscribed to Adobe, which that's a lot of revenue. And I don't know what the breakdown for Premiere is. And so, I mean, are we at some sort of user war? I don't know. But I would agree with Alex that in film and TV, there's just been... people have been ignoring it, but I think it's really sad. I watched The Banker last night, which was cut on Final Cut, and I was a little sad that there wasn't a little Final Cut logo at the end credits.
Right.
And I don't know, maybe it was just they wanted to, usually you recognize people who give you some sort of special deal or something at the end, but it's often you'll say cut on Avid or whatever.
Or our friend Jeffrey Orthwein did that with his movie. He had the Final Cut at the end, because I watched it and I showed my girlfriend, look, Final Cut right in the credits there.
And I was watching The Banker. I'm like, it's cut really, really well. And this idea that you have to use an Avid and somehow it's mystically tied to the end product is absurd to me at this point, because it's proven that you can do it other ways. I know Mike Mansdorf and Michael Yanovich have talked at length about, well, there's systems in place in Hollywood that Avid fits in well to. I'm like, yeah, but that whole there's so many needless steps that just, I guess, keep certain people employed. That once you break free of that mindset, I've cut like a dozen feature films in Final Cut, and it is such a pleasant experience overall.
The catch is, it's not about how good Final Cut Pro is. It's the fact that even if it could do everything that every NLE could do, it's the fact that people don't trust Apple. They just don't think that Final Cut matters, or even the Mac Pro matters to Apple enough so that they could be dropped at any moment. There's no Apple are not acting in a trustworthy sort of way, because they still have this old attitude of we don't say anything until ever, and essentially new updates show us how we're thinking. But unfortunately, if you're an Avid user, or a Premiere user, or a post-production workflow professional, you don't look at the new version of Final Cut and go, oh, so they're doing a little bit more to do with HDR. That's pretty cool. Why would they even look? Why would they even look at what the new features of the next version of Final Cut are? Even if they have all the features that they do, well, that's pretty impressive. They now have collaboration that's a bit better than Avid and not quite as good as Adobe. They don't even assess them. That's from Apple. Apple don't play the game. They don't play the game as if they even care about us. They don't publicly say they care. They don't say they're going to be sticking with this for another 10 years. They don't say that. They don't act as if third parties who do all the support, they don't act as if those people are actually going to be supported, or they should risk their business.
Well, here's the question: was the Pro market a fluke in the first place for Apple in terms of creating? Because before Final Cut, you had Premiere, which was kind of a prosumery level software, and you had Avid, and you had all these editors who liked their Macs because it was a creative. It was the computer for the creatives, but there wasn't a native Apple editing app. Final Cut Pro comes along. Randy has told Michael Horton that he wasn't really intending it to, even though they sat over the shoulders and observed Hollywood editors to try to figure out what they were doing and make it better or make it more approachable for new users. There wasn't this idea of catching the Hollywood market. And then Walter Murch, you read his book, or not his book, but the book about him cutting Cold Mountain behind the scene. Have you read that, either of you? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah,
and it's very clear that Apple's like, this may not work. You probably shouldn't do this. And then they kind of help him out, and he was doing it before there was XML support and all these ideas, and then you get this short-lived campaign, rather late in Final Cut's life. Final Cut Pro 5 and then really 6, so Final Cut Studio 2 or whatever,
right, is
when I remember the advertisements coming out, which Steve Bays says he actually went and shot some of those. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. Maybe I'll get in trouble. Anyway,
too late.
It's live. Oops. Anyway, but he was telling me he went out and interviewed Francis Ford Coppola, and he's like, the funny thing about that was Apple actually spent more on that advertisement than Coppola was spending on his independent film shot in Argentina. They had like more equipment and stuff, which I thought was really funny. So, and then it seems like an almost deliberate, in the transition to 10, the message rang loud and clear to professionals: you don't care about us anymore. And I wonder if in that shift they saw a broader, user base, and maybe they were sick and tired of the Hollywood people griping, and think about Steve Jobs versus Bill Gates. Steve Jobs was all about big leaps, and there's this argument that Bill Gates is like incremental updates, and the pro world seems satisfied with incremental, and Apple likes to take huge leaps, even if sometimes that takes a while to do, and that those different mindsets appeal to different users. So maybe that big leap to Final Cut 10 in some ways intentionally left some people behind that were holding back the development of the software. I don't have like a clear inside story on this. I just am observing, kind of the reaction. Sure. And where the software went. And initially we didn't have multicam. What does that say about how important Apple thought that was? Obviously, day one, they didn't think people needed it, and people freaked out about it. So they listened, they changed. But now we're in 2020, and I just want to circle back to one of your points about bubbles. When I talk to these people this year even about Apple's commitment to pros, they don't even know about the Mac Pro. Like, they don't know about the Pro Display XDR. They are not on the same blogs. They're not watching Apple's presentations. They don't care. They're just doing what they do, and they listen to the other people in their bubble about what they're using. And this guy who blocked me a month ago on Facebook.
What's his name? We'll give him a little plug.
I'm not going to name him. He's a TV editor who does a lot of like holiday films and whatnot. But he was like, no, everybody here uses Avid, and Premiere's okay for other people. No one uses Final Cut Pro, and it's just strange to me how the blinders are on. And we would think Apple's a giant company. Everybody knows about the Mac Pro, but yet these editors, these pockets, aren't even aware of it. That's shocking to me.
Yeah, you're right.
I mean, I'm a board of governors of the British Film Editors, which is the kind of the UK equivalent of ACE. And Netflix invited all us editors and various people and other people in the UK to say, hey, Netflix wants to meet all you editors, because we think you editors actually know what's really going on production these days. We're not necessarily... And this is like TV development people. These were workflow people for Netflix. And this is in London, and they hired a bar, and they had all those people turn up. And it was like, a couple of hundred people there, and it was a nice evening, open bar, all that kind of stuff. And... I don't go walk up to people and say you should use Final Cut Pro 10. I just talk about other stuff, to do with editing, to do with the movies, to do with TV in the UK and stuff like that. And the attitude when it came around and other people brought it up, sometimes they just say, well, this new Catalina thing's, this is in February. I don't, they're an iPhone company. I don't trust them. I feel pretty bad about what they did. They could do it again. They don't need us. Nobody in that group was interested, and they didn't. Why change? Let's stick with what we've got. This is pretty good. This is fine. And if you must insist on changing, then use Premiere. If that's what you want to use. And then there was people who used to be in the Final Cut world and now high up. They've had 10 years of moving on and moving high up and being workflow consultants. People who are part of the future definition of interchange formats for movies and like IMF and all that kind of stuff, which is interoperable, whatever. They were actually the people who had to move on because they were actually relying on Final Cut getting better and then being able to mark up a few Macs and then give support over a few months for workflows for TV and film in London. And they just moved on to something else. And there's no reason for them. Apple are not acting in such a way that they should be reassessed by any of these people. They're not doing anything different from their point of view. New computers and new bits on software updates and incremental updates for 9 years, because you're talking about big leaps of Final Cut Pro 10.
Right.
It's been rather incremental since then, right?
I would argue that there's been two or three that are significant
for us. Yeah. Absolutely. But if I show, I'd be essentially the only thing I could really show people that's different. Three things is like the UI change, so it looked a bit cooler in 10.3. And then also we've got some nice color grading things that actually look pretty cool, don't they?
And audio rolls. When I show sound people the audio roll stuff, their eyes light up. Everyone's like blown away. Wait a minute, what did you just do? It's so crazy to them. I think that people don't even understand or appreciate how powerful that is when they first see it.
But the thing is but who's making it? Does Apple court anyone? Do they sponsor anything? Do they have open? Do they do things publicly? Now. Yeah. Some people say, Apple, they asked me to consult on this film and they sort out problems, and Apple are really good at supporting filmmakers. And that's no good. What that is the Final Cut team sneaking around the rest of Apple, because the rest of Apple wouldn't let them really do that. So they have to keep it secret. It's like, why? What? So, this is the campaign. It's to Phil Schiller and to other people. It's not to...
Yeah, it's the idea that Apple has a singular voice, so everything has to go through that. And anything the marketing team and Pro Apps does has to go up the ranks and is probably going to be killed off by Phil Schiller before they can do the things they want to do.
The answer is The answer is to explain the situation we're in to the other Mac commentators, the ones that Phil Schiller listens to, like Gruber and Syracuse.
Yeah.
That's what we do. We get the wider, instead of the, let's say there's 20,000 people in our caring about Final Cut Pro 10 bubble enough to know really are counting down to the next update. Let's say there's 20,000 out of 3 million. There's certainly about 100,000 like us who, maybe 300,000 that care about the future of Mac OS and the Mac.
Right.
And all those podcasts and all those websites and all that marketing, all that kind of stuff. Brief those guys about how Apple are untrustworthy. Let them, they can provide a bit of pressure. Phil listens to some of these people. These people appear on those podcasts and those blogs. Apple value them to the extent that they have guests. Ms. Novielli of the iMac people going on.
Sure.
Podcast.
Well,
sorry, I'll just finish my point. I'm sorry to be going on, but
good.
Imagine if the pressure was put on by people who Apple kind of had to listen to because they've actually got hundreds of thousands of people listening to them. So that means briefing people. Now, we can't ask the Apple Final Cut Pro team to do that because they get in trouble if they ever found out. But maybe if these some other people, can actually educate the wider Apple commentariat about what's going on, then some pressure. The kind of people that Phil will go, oh, okay, maybe Anyway, how about that?
Well, so when the 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro came out, they had that event right after the Creative Summit in New York, which upset me because I felt like, why didn't they just... Oh,
it's okay. Remote control stopped working?
She wants to watch a show, I think, is what is going on here. Anyway, so I was upset that they... I wish they had just invited those... Like, Justine was in Cupertino. I wish they'd just done it with us, but we're not cool enough, apparently. And they did this New York thing the next week, and Jonathan Morrison sat down and interviewed Phil Schiller. And I thought that's somebody who would know our gripes and complaints and understand the fight that we're in. So I'm hoping that people like Jonathan Morrison or iJustine or Marquez or others that are kind of in the Apple tech commentary space have millions of followers. I'm sure Phil Schiller would listen to them. I mean, they're the same people that get a new iMac Pro or Mac Pro shipped to them to test out, and I'm sure some of this comes back to them. The other thing, though, is walking that line, because you hear horror stories of how many people sent in hate mail or death threats to Apple after Final Cut Pro 10 came out. And you don't want Final Cut to be a problem for Phil Schiller. That's like, well, why don't we just cancel the whole thing?
I missed that part of the documentary, Brad. I didn't. I
couldn't get those people to admit on camera that they. But I've heard through the grapevine different stories of just people sending it in, and it was very vocal and loud. I mean, it was obviously very public blunder that the vultures all circled around and picked the bones dry. So how much we don't know the internal workings. How over the years, how often has it been, let's not press this issue too much because we don't want to be, ProApps does not want to be the problem in the big Apple boardroom meeting or whatever.
I mean, the trick is to say Final Cut is doing a lot for Apple at the moment in terms of what Apple needs, in terms of promoting Metal to developers or explaining how good their GPU hardware is, or the Pro Display XDR, so people actually care about HDR and that kind of stuff. So it's doing a lot in terms of, it's doing stuff for Apple.
Yeah.
The briefing is, it could be doing 10 times as much if you look at it in a slightly different way in terms of integrating with, you could have as many users of it as iWork, or you could change tens of thousands or millions of people's small business ideas because they could be based around being workflow consultants to dentists or their local community or the people who could link in and use this collaboration stuff not to make big movies, but to go into their network and help them with their timeline a little bit, or just to help them out their little metadata for a little. And then just to empower people who want to take a chance, who want to go to a bank and get a loan, or go to their friends and say, this is what I'd be able to create, the business I will be able to create. They change their own story and change their own lives and the lives of the people around them, because video and video literacy is actually a really good thing.
Right.
It's crazy that Apple spends this time going, look at how much we're doing to help people learn Swift. We do got these schools in India and Italy and around the world. And look at all these kids and these students learning Swift. It's fantastic. And yet, if you think about day-to-day life, how many developers do we need versus how many people need to know how to tell stories using video? I think we need to tell stories of video a lot more than we need to do to develop apps. So it's really weird that video literacy is not seen as being a core thing that is the thing that distinguishes Apple as a thing that represents what iPads and Macs and stuff can do. And it's about Apple's definition of leaving the world a better place. And if people can use video to tell their stories or change their world, that's a pretty good way,
Well, and I'd say thanks to COVID, then maybe that's why we heard a mention of Final Cut and Logic and stuff on the earnings call. Video is even more important than it was 6 months ago.
Right.
In terms of expressing oneself and communicating ideas. Obviously, there's the live video conferencing component, but I think even just being able to create presentations or share ideas or tell stories, how important is being able to people expressing their opinions about the current political hot topics and things like that, and video. Yeah, I think if Apple could align themselves with that more publicly, it would benefit them greatly.
I mean, what used to be called the small home office, SOHO, there's a definition of as kind of a medium-sized, business, what we would these days call a prosumer, but it used to be SOHO or something like that, small and home office or something like that. If Final Cut and Motion and the video applications group team could be supporting people to take that leap, that's a thing. If you make what the video applications team do, make the rest of Apple really excited that they do it on their own terms and that they are trusted to know what to do and what to add to those software because they know what they're doing, it means that Apple will want them to do the right thing, as opposed to Apple going, well, you're really useful to us, so we're going to make you do these various things that help the rest of Apple but aren't necessarily about your audience because, hey, we're not quite sure what you can really do for us, apart from make sure that Adobe doesn't have a stranglehold over us to make it so that if they take away Premiere from our machines, we won't be able to sell Macs anymore.
Right,
which is essentially what that was all about, in terms of we'll always have the media creation tools on Mac OS. But I don't know. It's getting the rest of Apple excited about Final Cut, and not to say it's a problem, but it's to what extent it's a missed opportunity. And obviously, I think the Apple commentators will go, oh, okay, that sounds like something we could complain in a positive way towards Apple about missing an opportunity.
If you go all the way back to the late 90s when Jobs returned, one of the first things presentations he did when in 99 with FireWire and the iMac TV is he showed these videos that the executive team at Apple made. And I was reading Becoming Steve Jobs, which is a book about Steve, kind of how he evolved and became a better business person.
Right.
And this author actually really poo-pooed, or these authors, there's two of them, they took the attitude that iMovie was essentially a failure. And they cite examples of how Steve was really excited about everybody going to make their own videos, and that the executive team at that time found it really, really hard to cut videos together and really confusing, even with something as simple as iMovie. And then he's like, luckily, Steve changed his strategy and was convinced to focus more on iTunes and the iPod. I thought the author's conclusion was wrong because he was looking at it from an older person's perspective and not seeing my age group, which I was a teenager at that time, and how FireWire completely changed our relationship with video. I mean, I went from cutting on VHS decks and trying to pipe in the stereo audio on the right track and have the dialogue on the left track to, being able to do so much on the computer. and have the quality just get much better. And it's not just me. I mean, you're like, oh, Brad, you're kind of a niche group, but it was just my entire, we were all in high school hopping on iMacs and making videos. And it was just something that I think took some time to get to that level. And, maybe the fact that it wasn't a quick, thing, like we can sell 1 million of copies of this overnight, maybe that's part of why the attention of the spotlight wasn't on there. And then has not really been on Final Cut as much, or iMovie and Final Cut as much as we think it should be.
I mean, if you can say creating a new business based around creating video literacy in your world is a thing is a risk, but we're going to be there for your risk, and we want you to escape from what you're doing and doing that thing. That's quite compelling.
Yeah,
it's the modern Apple. It's not the Apple of iMacs in your home and introducing the concept of having a home computer that is actually a Mac, which is kind of what you were doing, 97, 99, 2001. Now it's like, I want to be able to have a bit more control over my life, or at least to be able to have the chance to risk something or learn something so I can make a risk in the future. And Apple being the kind of company that helps people change their lives in the ways that is empowering to them. It seems very old school Apple, and there's like 1984 kind of, wheels for the mind kind of stuff. We haven't that much of that recently. In theory, the iPad could be thought of in that way if they start helping there actually be a pro apps market for it. But unfortunately, the race to the bottom on price is like, I mean, that's another thing that could be talked about at WWDC is we're now going to allow certain kinds of app models and certain upgrades for iPad apps, not on the Mac, not on the phone, but on iPad apps. If you have an iPad app, you can charge for upgrades, which means you can charge $35 for it and then $5 for an update that make it do more. And if you use your iPad Pro and you use that software, you go, great, I want to give them $5 in order to make that program better, because it's the thing that it is my edge over somebody who's stuck using a PC using something that's not that great because they just know PCs.
Now, if they do bring Final Cut Pro to the iPad, is it only going to be for the iPad Pro?
I don't know how you make that distinction.
Yeah.
Well, they have apps that don't work on the phone. They have apps that just work on iPads.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Apple are quite good at not introducing artificial differences based on marketing systems, because if you have a faster you have a faster iPad that's faster than an old iPad Pro, why not make it work on the faster one that won't work on the first version of iPad Pro?
Okay.
I would think that the catch with Final Cut Pro on the iPad, there's a couple of catches. Firstly, if you make it free for people who got it on the Mac, as part of your purchase that you made in 2011 or whenever you decide to make it, that does not establish the app market on the iPad as something for people to make money out of. If you're thinking, oh, I'm going to bring my compositing app that works in Linux to the iPad because I know I'll be able to sell lots of copies to it, and then the bank says so, or the investors say so, how much money do apps sell for on the iPad? And they'll say, well, $5, $20. Right. And what about updates? Can people subscribe? And go, not really. And then the other problem with that Final Cut on the Mac, on the iPad is like, oh, great, Apple have now taken over the world of video editing on the iPad because now they've got their app on it. So they've not really created a market for competitors, because it's a bit like, that was the problem with Mac Write in 1984. It was such a much better word processing program that even Microsoft Word coming along was very hard, because Mac Write was free, came with the Mac in 1984. Like, great, can't really establish a word processing market on the Mac because there's already one that comes free with it that's better than we can make.
Right.
So they have to be really careful about that. So I think the key to Final Cut Pro on the iPad, weirdly enough, is changing the way that developers can charge for the software, and that means we have to pay for it on the iPad separately, even if we've got a copy on the Mac. And also it means waiting a while to give people a kind of space for other people to develop some stuff and for Apple to promote those guys and gals, because essentially if it's like it's the Apple show on the iPad, it's software from Apple, great.
I guess I was thinking more along the lines of the USB-C connection, because you're going to have to access, a lot more media than we can now if you want to do Final Cut Pro on the iPad.
Absolutely.
That's what I'm thinking. It has to be a USB-C iPad, so whatever they want to call that, because otherwise, 512 gigabytes.
I mean, the crazy thing is that it might be that they use an iPad as a co-processing device in order to emulate the new ARM Macs that are coming, saying, oh, you want to develop some software for the ARM Mac? Well, you can run your software on the CPU and GPU that's inside this iPad that's connected to your Mac, and then you could do all the development of the Mac, but the actual compiling and the thing that's got control of the keyboard and the thing that's running the screen is really the iPad that's next to it. So this is one of the things that they could be announcing next week in terms of our Mac development via iPad, and it being like essentially like an external GPU or CPU for the Mac, and then the OS is actually running on the iPad. Who knows what they're going to announce? It's lots to look forward to. That's just Monday, let alone all the other sessions on AV Foundation and machine learning, hardware, and the future of all these kind of things, and new iMacs maybe, and actually a slightly entry level display. Is Apple only slightly entry level in terms of displays, and new design language for new hardware and stuff like that. It's a lot to look forward to.
I've heard about the new iMac design. Is that going to be the iMac Pro as well, do you think? It'd be both?
I don't know. I mean, the thing is that it would make sense for them if they want to establish if they do have a new display. It depends on the display. If you can make it so one display looks like the iMac, the new iMac, and the new iMac Pro looks like the Pro Display XDR. So you'd have a stone grater backing to the iMac Pro, because you'd actually have it next to your Pro Display XDR when you're doing stuff, and you look from the back and it looks like two almost exactly the same things. But then you have your Pro Display or just XDR display or Apple Display, whatever you want to call it. It'd be 6K but not HDR, and then it would be designed so that next to it would be the new iMac, and they would look to some extent different from each other. In terms of their pairs of computer and screen, so that maybe the visual language and the design language are actually will be the new queuing. So we've seen the design language of the Pro Display XDR, and maybe the iMac Pro could show that it's part of that world, which is separate from the world of iMacs, the new iMac. Yeah.
How well do you think the Mac Pro is selling? Not the display, but just the Mac Pro itself.
The current one, I think it sells perfectly fine. We think it's been a while. It's time for an update. Effectively, it's such a great deal even now. If you set it up the right way and you're using the right software, it's not like you're complaining about how slow the current iMac Pro is. It's more that we kind of just like to have more for the same price. It depends on how boring our update. Would you risk the new iMac Pro being an ARM-based Mac? Would you wait and then buy an ARM-based Mac that software has to be recompiled for, or it really depends. It depends on how they do the transition. Or would you buy the last iMac Pro that runs on Intel? Because next summer then one that comes out in the fall of next year is going to be on ARM. It's not straightforward.
No, I realize the ARM thing. I would surmise that they're just going to bring some low-level Macs to ARM, the MacBook or MacBook Air or something, initially, because it's going to take years to get it up to the level of the Mac Pro that I have. It's not going to be just you plug something in and it's ready to go. Well,
I hope so. Otherwise, no. But in your case, obviously you want that to be true to some extent because you've invested in a new machine. But that CPU is socketed in your new iMac, Mac Pro.
Yes.
It's a socket, right? That's the first thing I thought.
Standard.
That's interesting.
Standard.
Okay.
Standard socket.
Whereas, exactly. So imagine if they say, okay, for $2,500, Richard, you have the opportunity to change the CPU inside your iMac Pro from 2019. Sorry, your Mac Pro from 2019, and it's got a new ARM, equivalent. And it can do this much more or the same or whatever. They have to make it enough of a...
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I would wonder if that's even possible considering that...
The rest of the architecture.
Yeah, like I remember having to pair certain logic boards to certain CPUs when I built computers, so I don't even know. But maybe they had the foresight to do it.
The crazy thing is that people talk about, the ARM-based CPU, the CPU ARM A series chip. Inside iPhones and iPads are systems on a chip. They're not just the CPU.
Okay.
I am much more interested in the new GPU power that we're all going to get, because all our software lives in the GPU, nearly all of it, and it's all about parallel processing. It is all about GPU work. And Apple will be making their GPUs for the iPad and the iPad Pro pretty well. 120 frames a second updates and the kind of ProMotion displays, and that's the GPU power that I'm interested in. And if that GPU constraint is not limited to low power or low heat, what can they do with almost exactly the same layout for their, if they could think in terms of cell processing, you just go, okay, well, if you put, we'll have one GPU in a MacBook Pro, a new A series GPU, and we'll have four in a MacBook Pro, and we'll have between, same in a Mac Mini. But then in a Mac Pro, we could have we'll have a card, or where the afterburner card goes, or wherever you want to put it. You put a whole load of, imagine how much space the GPU takes up in an iPad Pro. Not very much. Imagine if you multiplied that by 64, it will probably still fit on a card that goes inside a Mac Pro. That's that GPU thing, and having 64 times the power of the thing that's driving an iPad Pro now. Interesting in terms of scalability, and also for all the scientific stuff that people use computers for, and also huge databases and machine learning, all that kind of stuff, which is very, in terms of having to say goodbye to OpenGL, and what are they going to do next week in WWDC? They're going to talk about high-end multiple parallel processing support in future versions of Mac OS, and that's the kind of thing that maybe their systems on a chip and kind of cell-based GPUs. And what I wrote in a post to actually, I think it was 2 years ago. Shouldn't Apple create an NPU, a neural processing unit, and then have multiple neural processing units? And the unit is based on one in an Apple Watch, scaling up to 256 in a Mac Pro. And you just have different amounts depending on the platform, 2 in an Apple TV, or whatever you need a neural processing unit to do in terms of processing and understanding. Understanding's a bit far. Analyzing different kinds of data and what it needs to do to be useful to you, which might lead to things like conversational computing, in which you talk to your technology in a form of a conversation, and it actually knows you relatively well, which may be the future of user interface design.
So does anybody think there's going to be a major surprise with Final Cut Pro, the next version? I mean, all the normal things we talk about. We talk about an audio-based rolls mixer. We're talking about a lot of other usual things. Is there going to be a big surprise? I mean, we talk about collaboration. People talk about, some of the normal stuff. What about a big surprise of some sort that say, wow, we weren't expecting that? Because they like to do that, right? Well, they love to do that.
The way these surprises work is that when we're told about the surprise, we don't get it for a few days.
Right.
It's really funny. Right. It's like some kind of setting or some kind of thing, and they mention it, and then it's only by actual practical use of these things you go, I thought that was just a minor thing that they mentioned, just like it's like the 11th feature in their top 10 list. But that's the actual thing that means something, that communicates a different way of thinking about something, that is setting something up for a future. So
10.2
anyway.
was 3D text and effects presets. And which one do I like more?
Right.
Which one helps me every day?
Right.
So that's the thing. There's a chance. There's a good chance it could happen any time, and there's a good chance we won't recognize it, because
initially, you mean?
Exactly. So we'll see. I mean, there's.
I think there's going to be something that we're not expecting, that nobody's looking for yet, because it just seems like it's so long. They have to be doing something besides a normal update.
Well, the thing is that I tweeted. This got something like 60 retweets. It's like one of the most popular tweets of the last few weeks. Is just because it's taken a long time doesn't mean we'll have lots of big new features. What we might have is a few small features that were very hard to implement, and we won't know why. So we will look at it and go, okay, this is not it's an underwhelming update, but we won't know all the various political, technical
Sure.
battles between different suppliers, between NVIDIA and GPUs and Metal, and battles with the operating system people and battles with the hardware people. That one little thing, that one little checkbox, that thing which is, well, that's quite nice. That was the thing they sweated blood over for 20,000 hours, and 60 people. People were spending 100-hour weeks on, and they just have to do that first before they do something else.
Right.
I mean,
that would be the foundational stuff. That would make sense if there's some kind of foundational change they're making going forward. But of course, there will be some features as well to placate.
From a marketing perspective, I would hope that they'd recognize that they need something headliner, something big.
Yeah. Not 3D text.
For
yes.
10.5, we're due. I would hope that's where we're at, but who knows? I mean, Logic 10.5 wasn't radically different from earlier versions of Logic. There were nice new things in it, but it wasn't a radically huge thing. I didn't. And correct me if I'm wrong, Richard. There was some cool things, but
I suppose the equivalent is as it got GarageBand features. It's a bit like we suddenly get iMovie's moving maps in Final Cut Pro. It's like the
right, or audio ducking that iMovie has,
or maybe making custom trailers or making movies based out of insert your stuff here.
Doesn't that feel like something that got abandoned though? Like Randy shows off trailers, and we're like, oh my gosh, like even Charlie Austin, who's a trailer editor, has commented on, well, my job's going to be gone in 10 years, and yet he's still happily working cutting trailers because that stuff never really reached the full potential. I see so much potential in something like that, but
especially if we as editors could create our own template kits for these things. Yeah. So it's like, oh, I need to market a dentist. I want to sell a template kit to dentists so that they all say, look, get these 17 clips representing that you are from your locality and of your patients and all these things, and insert them here, put your logo in here, drop them all in, and then now you've got this, and you could sell that for $50. And people, yeah, that's easily worth $50. I'm like 3/4 of the way of having my video made, and it's like, this is the kind of thing that the engineering is already there inside. They had an authoring tool to make those trailer things, obviously, and when Final Cut Pro 10.2 came out, when Motion was then based on Final Cut. I think I have to finish soon.
Oh, dinner?
On forever, 2 hours and 20 minutes or something like that.
So
that authoring tool was there in 2012 or whenever it was when iMovie moved over to Final Cut Pro basis. Where's that authoring tool for us to create these things? Now, this is not sexy for us. This is not sexy for the people saying we want collaboration and we want next version of the biggest movies in the world, Avatar to be edited on Final Cut Pro. But the idea of this would be an example of a headline like grabbing thing saying, oh, lots of business opportunities for lots of people out there who have insights into a market to be able to create tools to help lots of people understand that market and sell to them or market to them or have a relationship with them or to build a community based on these things. Not sexy for us, but pretty cool for the future of Apple and Final Cut Pro.
Sure. And iMovie, because that's likely what you would be pushing is some sort of iMovie template that they can cut on their phone. They can go get the shots on their phone, put it in, and the nice thing is if Apple, the limitation for Apple to do this is they can only come up with so many template designs. We all recognize a certain title or transition on YouTube that's used in Final Cut. But you open that up for third party, and now you have thousands of different little video templates, and it'll be a lot harder to be like, it's that one, especially because, people like you, Alex, know how to give people options to customize motion templates. Well, it'll be the same thing for an editor handing something. You can pick your company's colors, you can resize the logo, you can have some flexibility, and then they could just they spend a minimal amount of money, and I'm sure there'll be some resistance for certain videographers and people who are like, that's my business, you just took away my business. But then you realize you make so much more money because you're going to have so many more clients. You're gonna have so many more customers. You replace the clients with like hundreds or thousands of customers.
Right.
If you're worried about your business, try and work out what your work is supposed to achieve in the client's world. And if you can't do it the way you used to do it because of COVID, because of whatever reason, then work out what other things you can do to achieve that same change in their world. And they'll just go, yeah, okay, do it that way then.
Yep.
You know,
Right.
we can't do it at a conference, but we can do it with, I don't know, a forum in which we discuss stuff together and are together. What it produces the same effect, it creates a community in those people's lives. It's another way of, you have to work out what the actual effect of what is necessary. I make videos for people and I cause change in their world and their lives and their business or their community or whatever it happens to be. And I'll use whatever method that happens to be relevant. So you could be using Reality Composer for free, and you could be sending somebody on their iPhone a Reality Composer project as an iMessage, and then suddenly they look around their world and see, wow, this is their way that they see their world through AR. And it's a free tool that's available, from Apple.
So the last question for WWDC, are we going to see Blackmagic on stage anytime, anywhere?
I don't know. I want Blackmagic Raw in Final Cut. I feel very tired of saying that, but it's not actually a want. It's been a real pain point for me and some friends recently. Yeah. Not being able to cut B-Raw into Final Cut is just annoying. So I want that, and I want ProRes Raw in Resolve.
I think the audience don't know who Blackmagic are. It's the audience. Either the audience at home or the audience and developers.
Well, Resolve was on stage last year with the Mac Pro. Not on stage, they were shown.
But what I mean is they need a story in order to justify them being there. Yeah. So the story would be, here's what we're doing to make Codex so much better, and we're going to combine metadata into Codex, and it's going to be illustrated by Blackmagic being really happy, and a company like Blackmagic, or somebody else in our world going on and saying the reason why this is really good for us is because the way it used to be was this, and now the way it's going to be is that, thanks to Apple and this wonderful new development. So I think that's why you should be involved in using this in your projects, namely this new way of doing codecs. In the case of Blackmagic, it would be, I don't know what else, or sidecar files actually being built in a modern way, or I don't know what it would be, but Blackmagic would have to be there in order to explain a wider, exciting new world for Mac OS and iOS in general, not the fact that it's made Final Cut Pro better or Resolve better, because the audience go, okay, great, so what? Yeah. From their point of view. But if they say, look, codecs used to be like this, they are the way we used to think about them back in 1995. Here's how we think about them in 2020, 25 years later, and it's so much better. And the reason why is because of this, and this is why AV Foundation of Mac OS and iOS and tvOS is so much better with this new way of thinking about it. That's how you get Blackmagic on stage, and how you use it.
I was going to ask you, Brad, about your 6K Blackmagic camera, and it's got to be frustrating not being able to edit in Final Cut Pro.
Well, especially because I've been doing some shoots where we're using the A10 Mini Pro with 3 Blackmagic Pocket cameras.
Right.
And this is a limitation on the Blackmagic side, but there's 2 things that frustrate me about it. The A10 Mini takes control of the cameras, and I can actually adjust the shutter speed, the iris.
Oh, okay.
And some settings and white balance and everything through my MacBook Pro, or I also have an app that lets me do it. But it also takes it sends timecode out. That's cool.
Right.
But the frustrating thing is you cannot select ProRes to record to when it's hooked up to the Mini Pro. You have to record in Blackmagic Raw, which means if we then want to edit that in Final Cut Pro, we have to transcode it first. So that was the first thing. The second thing that annoyed me was that I have the Mini Pro, which lets you record out to a USB drive. That's really cool. I thought with the cameras connected, since it controls it, when I hit record on the Mini Pro, that the cameras would then all start recording at the same time. That would be great. Nope, you have to hit all of them independently. And I'm like, it's just
you mean you can't do that on the new ATM Mini?
No, I have to hit record on the cameras.
Physically on the cameras. Yeah.
Yep. And now when I switch angles, it'll change the color of the tally light, so I can see, it's recording, and now this one's the active camera. That's cool. But for some reason, they just stopped short of. I mean, imagine how awesome it'd be. Hit record, boom, all the cameras are recording. Especially if you're doing this yourself at home and you've got 2 or 3 cameras hooked up. You don't want to have to stand up and hit record.
No, that's got to be coming in a software update, don't you think?
Yeah, I think those 2 things, and especially because obviously B-RAW is going to eat up more space than if maybe I just want to record in 1080 or 4K ProRes LT or something.
Right.
Because it's just a little event video or something or presentation, and I don't care about having it in 6K B-RAW. But right now that's a limitation. It's incredibly irritating. So I did another one of these multicam things, and we were testing out the Sumo, the Atomos Sumo, which is also 19, which is also a multicam switch. It records on the Sumo itself, but it only takes HD SDI in, and I lose the time code, the camera control. So it's a weird, like, which direction do I go? And the Mini Pro is so close to being really cool. The cool thing about the Sumo and the Atomos projects is that it saves an XML with the isolated HD streams. So you can actually go in, open that up in Final Cut, and then take your camera originals and just swap them out in the angle editor. And now you could, boom, upgrade your multicam edit to full 4K or 6K or whatever, and then do the re-edit in Final Cut. So there's some cool options there. But yeah, the Mini Pro, that's what I'm using right now to feed through a Blackmagic cinema camera.
Right.
Not the 6K, because I figure I can just leave this camera just sitting here.
Yeah, that's what I did with the GH4. It's been sitting there for months.
And this is a 16. This is my 15-inch MacBook Pro from late 2016. And
it looks great. It looks great.
It shows that lighting. This is like an $80 ring light. That's just a $7 bulb in a normal desk lamp, and 6 daylight bulbs over there in the corner ends up being the thing that makes a really crappy 720p camera actually not look so bad.
Right. So speaking of that, when are they going to put a 1080p camera in the MacBook Pro?
Oh my gosh!
It's just after all this time, the only one that has it is the iMac Pro. They've had it for years, but it's amazing when the new one came out, and the 16-inch came out in 2019.
I think the reason why is because if you're using FaceTime, Skype, or whatever, it compresses it so heavily anyway, sometimes to standard def resolution. So they're like, why? I mean,
but how much can it cost?
I can see the benefit of putting a higher resolution chip in, because what if more people are recording themselves, and now I don't have to go out and buy the Logitech camera, another camera, an A10 Mini. I can just use the MacBook Pro itself.
Right. Well, the point, I've got 4 4K cameras in my iPhone, 4 4K, and the 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro has a 720p camera. That doesn't make sense to me.
The answer is, we realize that you and your MacBook Pros, you want a good camera, and that's why we're switching over to ARM, so that we can put a proper camera in there.
Okay, there we go.
That's why in your new MacBook Pro, only the good quality cameras are only available on the new ARM-based chips.
Gotcha.
No, I think. Are we going to see a new MacBook Pro this year? I'm kind of waiting a little bit.
Well, the upgrade early this week for the 16-inch means that won't be upgraded at least until, I don't know, October, because of the new updates in the last few days.
Okay.
So anyway, I do have to go, because people in my life are saying, wait a minute, I think it's been 2.5 hours now.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I appreciate Alex, and it's fun to chat with you.
Both of you guys.
At the events and everything.
Both of you guys. I got fingers pointing to both sides. I don't have to worry about which side's which.
Cool.
I appreciate it, guys. We'll talk to you next week after WWDC happens, and we'll see what happens.
Cool. Excellent. Right. Thanks very much for inviting me. Thank you.
Absolutely. Talk to you guys later.
See you. Bye.